I'm honored to introduce our next presenter. I met Ben several years ago at Penland, when an enthusiastic student in my class spoke highly of him and later introduced me to him. I was immediately struck by his technical knowledge regarding etching and granulation, which has become the signature of his work. His pieces take modern materials, or his pieces take on the aesthetic of an ancient technique, granulation, but in an entirely new way with modern materials. He is pushing a historical technique forward. Ben is a studio artist, teacher, product designer, and researcher. Not only is his work beautiful, he has also contributed to the field by creating an etching method that is safer, cleaner, and non-toxic for metalsmiths. His work can be found in the M. Price Bank Collection in Wichita, Kansas, and the Evansville Museum of Art, History, and Science in Illinois. Please help me welcome Ben Dory.
Hey everybody. Wally, thank you. That was special. I forgot to turn off my messages, so hopefully you're not reading those the entire time. Okay. Hi everybody. Such a pleasure to be here. I'm deeply honored to be asked. I regard the Seattle Metals Guild with the highest respect, so it's truly a pleasure to talk to all of you. Today I'm going to talk about my trajectory with stainless granulation. I'm going to talk about how it works, break down the machines and the methods, how it's developed, and where it's going. And this is an interesting crossroads for me right now, because I'm trying to figure out if you identify with a certain type of work, and people identify you with that, but you want to introduce new things, like how do you go about doing that? So research and discovery are really critical to how I think about the studio, and I hope I convey that as we go through this today. So in the beginning, before working full-time as stainless, the pieces on the right were pretty typical of my studio output about 7 to 8 years ago. I was moving around quite a bit. Having a mobile studio was really critical to my ability to continue working. I was working with carbon steel primarily, making a lot of tools, and playing with textures, stone setting, damascene, and etching. And before getting into etching silver, which was more of like a research passion project, I was etching lots of steel and aluminum. It's important to point out at this point that I'm working on the computer quite a bit, and this will come up again and again. The broach backs are laser cut stainless, those tabs folding around the bottom form, and vinyl masks were used for all of my etching. And then just relying on vector software, whether it was Illustrator or something else. So critical to this narrative, at one point I was able to buy a used resistance welder. So it's that tack 2 on the back right of my bench right there. At that point, this broach on the bottom is only about 1.5 inches wide, and I was tacking on tiny hypodermic tubing in place before soldering it, because it would move everywhere, or it would crush under heat if you made clips to hold it in place. It's just an old video I found, but I found it incredibly convenient that I could also apply earring backs onto these steel earrings here and other kind of semi-production work. It was important that I was trying to eliminate soldering from this whole thing, like from the acid and the heat. Like you can't move around kind of readily if you're carrying all those things along with you. And then if you're not familiar with resistance welding, this post on the upper right, there's that little nib I think you can see. So that's the critical component to that whole system. So to illustrate how resistance works in a circuit, these are just the fuses you would find in your car connected to your stereo, your horn. I think they're still in new cars, I'm not sure. But looking at them, you see these two flat bridges, and then this thin shape in between, either that U shape or that S shape. So if the circuit is overloaded, that thin bridge will melt and stop the electrical flow. So you're essentially shorting the circuit there. It's going to protect everything that's sensitive after that. So it works because as the current is bottlenecking into that little spot, it generates heat, but not just a little bit, it generates an incredible amount of heat. So when I'm doing stainless granulation, I'm shorting a circuit on purpose every single time. And I want to be very clear that I didn't make this up. These tack welders had a vacuum that came with it, or an attachment that you can buy, and there were also a few rare articles in the world. ABI did not put this one out. This was a goldsmith somewhere in the Midwest, I believe. And then there are other articles on Gnocsen that you could find. But all were pretty big. These machines are kind of famously finicky. So you can see that vacuum pump sitting on the welder in the middle there. So the idea is that you can pick up a granule or solder or anything small, and that's welded, or that's wired into the welder. So you see the positive and negative line. You place the item where you want, you hit a pedal, and hopefully it's going to stick right there. It's just going to tack it in place. If you use enough energy or you have the right balance, it'll weld it into place. But the main issue with these machines that there usually wasn't enough energy to make it to the weld properly and consistently. So these wires are 18 gauge, so really small for all that electricity to flow from the interior of the machine, bottleneck into that wire, and then come back out on the other end. And then the tip of this vacuum, you need it to make your own relay. They sold a few, but as you weld more and more, they become damaged quickly. They will pick up residual metals, flowing the other way as it melts, and then they'll just corrode slowly. And part of this whole system is that you need really good, clean connection points, and if there's any porosity, something like that, that's going to weaken the weld. So after reading those articles, and just those few others, I bought this vacuum kind of on a whim and a hunch that this could be applied to other purposes. And there's this kind of sense of risk, financial risk, and kind of chaos and experimenting that I'm always kind of falling into. But this hunch worked. These are the kind of very first sets that came out. And sorry about the really, really bad picture on the upper left. But that's the very first piece that I made, really. And I think Emily's wearing it today if you want to take a look at it. So still carbon steel, and then that one was pierced out, and I was just looking at portals and windows and stuff like that, and trying to make a decent composition. So I'm playing around here, filling space. Those tetrahedral stacks still on the top left, those seemed like the plausible kind of solution. So stacking apples and oranges or cannonballs, whatever it is, this type of kind of geometric structure is something that I think just seems to work, and we lean into it. So craft schools, especially the Penland School of Craft, were especially important during this time. It was only a week, but I attended their first winter residency, and that really gave me a moment and kind of a quiet space in my mind to navigate some of these hurdles. So all these pendants are about 1.5 inches tall, and the smallest granules, and still are 1 millimeter. And just moving forward, I kind of just sourced these wherever I could, but these are the internal components for bearings. And I buy them by the tens of thousands. In a pack of 50,000 will be that one. And they're kind of irregular here, and I found out there's different grades. So as you move towards a theoretical grade 0, they become more spherical. So grade 100 is usually what I buy, but something like grade 10,000 would be tumbling media. So one very cool perk of the process is that the welding heat is localized, since none of these materials are very conductive. And it's really important that you work with non-conductive materials, because that means the weld is going to stay where you want it to go. So if you introduce silver, which is hyperconductive, or copper on the other side of it, the electricity is going to go where it needs to, on the path of least resistance. So what that means is that the heat is super, super localized. So if you imagine a sphere sitting on a flat surface, like that's a tiny point of contact, and that's where the weld's gonna happen each time. So on the more dangerous side of using these welders, like so they're kind of famously finicky, if I am holding this vacuum and I'm like holding a metal component here, and then I'm holding the workpiece on the other side, and I hit that pedal, that means you're shooting like 40 to 60 volts through your heart. So it hurts. And I mean, it didn't happen often, but often enough. So I think that kind of increased the learning curve moving forward. Or lessened it, I suppose. But that doesn't happen anymore. I have more sophisticated machines here. So these are the welders I use all the time in the studio. On the right, which might be more familiar, is an Orion 150 pulse arc welder. So I use this for fabrication. Essentially, it's a TIG welder. On the left, a little more obscure, is the Sunstone CD100. So the CD here stands for capacitive discharge. And that's another way to describe resistance, just talking about a different part of the process. So in the middle of the CD welder, so this is it gutted right here, you see that tall cylinder, and it's about 6 inches tall and 3 inches wide. And so in like more kind of stereo, something like that, the same component would be the size of a Tylenol or something like really small and lozenge shaped. So it's enormous. So what happens is you set your wattage, and then it's going to fill that capacitor with that total charge, and then when you hit a pedal, it releases it all at once. And then studying the ABI welder, I was able to make my own attachments. And this means that with a larger gauge wire, so before I said it was the 18 gauge in their wiring, these are 10 and 12 gauge. So a lot of electricity is moving through the whole system. And this means I can get stronger welds, cleaner welds, and I just have more control in general. So on the top left is a vacuum, but this is actually a fish pump. So you just go to the pet store for like a bubbler in your aquarium. So if you open these up, there's a little gasket and a plastic piece, and it moves back and forth, and that generates the bubbles or the push. So if you just flip that over, you create a micro vacuum, essentially. And then that's connected to the black line, so that's the airflow going into this handpiece right here. And you can see kind of two parts to it. The yellow line is going to go to the welder's positive part, and that's plugged into that same part. The black line going to the vacuum, and then there are 3 brass and silver tips of different sizes right above that. And then those hold silver inserts, and those are my consumables. So as you're welding, you're degrading this specific piece, and I just pop these out and put new ones in as they get ruined. And if there's a bad weld, it'll blow up the whole thing. If not in like a dramatic way, it just ruins the tip. And then these are just crimp tubes used in beading. So you can buy these by like the hundreds or thousands as you need to as well. And then on the right is a contact pad. So this is a 14 gauge sheet of copper. That purple line is going to go to the welder negative, and then electricity is flowing like to the pad, like as you're welding, or in the circuit, like you're flowing to the pad. And then on the bottom is a quick change connection to the TIG welder, in case I need to like fabricate anything. And then the last like really critical component, I was talking about how you need that secure hold. The engraving ball, it's been tapped, and then this will go to the welder, and then the steel on those is like a lot softer than it might seem, so it works really well to like machine it and change it if you have one of these. It's totally adaptable. And this gives me some maneuverability and like the weight that you expect in an engraving ball. It's really important to have something like that working on rings and the bottom of rings, so I can kind of see what I'm doing. And then on the right is just like a really old machinist vise that I found in some store in Illinois. But it's perfect. It's like the ultimate tool steel. It'll like destroy your files. So I hold, that one's really critical because it has smooth jaws. So if I'm holding, again, like in the example of a ring, like holding a ring shank sideways, on the flat sides, like I get a complete connection. So the goal here is to create an hourglass shaped system where the energy bottlenecks down to where the individual sphere's connection is that smallest part in the system. And kind of hit the ground running after figuring out some of these things. So I've always loved this crescent gorget shape. So like this old piece of neck armor that became obsolete with the advent of gunpowder. It turned into a piece of jewelry you would see kind of like colonial commanders wear. And I'm going through a titanium phase here. And all these metals, like besides being not very conductive, they're hypoallergenic. So I have like tons of studio allergies. And part of this story is figuring out how to keep working, but kind of like avoid the negative aspects of that. So again, no acid, there's not a lot of like, kind of like buffing compound going around, no open flame. So the brooch on the top left and that ring are probably kind of like the height of that titanium period. But I gave it up in the end. Like I do love working with titanium, but it's like really smudgy. And it also creates really brittle welds with stainless alloys. So what could be like a really nice weld for like a stainless granule to a sheet of stainless, like these will pop off at the most inopportune time. And then at the same time with this mokume brooch up here, that central piece, I'm developing methods to kind of essentially set it like a stone. But you need to make sure that the granule isn't in contact with that conductive metal, because again, the circuit's going to flow somewhere else and like damage this nice piece that's been kind of developed into a finished form. So both of the brooches are about 4 inches across. Like everything is rather large, especially the brooches and rings you'll see. And then that stone is maybe like 20 millimeters. So I like this like macro jewelry. At the same time, and leaning into computer work, and this will come up more and more often, at this time I'm working at SCAD in Savannah, managing a large rapid prototyping lab. I'm spending an incredible amount of time 3D scanning, editing files, and modeling for student work, teaching teachers how to kind of like do something new in their classroom. And I've just like loved computers my whole life and have always kind of had this as part of my process. So on the left is just a recreation of a student industrial design project. But I took that and 3D scanned it and remodeled it and textured it, and that means in this world like adding materials to it for rendering. And the idea is to build a database that you could rotate the objects and like look over the student work from X number of years. And then on the right side, that's just modeled in like a digital clay and ZBrush, and that's for a bar that was just starting in Savannah at the time, so like a 2-ounce shot glass. And using these tools to be, especially in the case of the shot glass, like having that volume be exact and having all this like, having digital tools available like kind of really opens up the world, because I'm really not the most precise jeweler. Like I rely on my materials to an incredible extent to maintain that precision. And then I'm just showing you these because after leaving SCAD and learning all these kind of like methods and techniques with software, like this really plays into kind of like how I think about work now. Especially with learning new software, they're all pretty similar. So if you're using like an off-brand Adobe product, it's just as good as everything else. So sometimes free software was the only way I could like continue working in this thing. So we left Savannah for 3 years, and an opportunity came up to become the Wingate Artist in Residence and visiting professor at the University of Arkansas in Little Rock. So much like working at SCAD, but in different ways, I had an incredible amount of resources. This was the first time that I had a job directly related to a studio practice, and that changes everything. You're kind of like living in your work. So in addition to maintaining and running a metals program, I was tasked with developing a CAD/CAM curriculum for their design students. And where SCAD seemed to have unlimited resources, I had to figure out kind of how to budget things for everyone. And this is where finding free software was really critical. So everything needed to be available to the students in a different kind of like income bracket. And it was an interesting challenge, but really important to me. And it kind of hit home because never being able to afford gold, like I've always used gold foil, like in the Damascene we saw at the beginning, using CZs instead of other stones, and except in like special circumstances, copper and brass or silver if I wanted to make some kind of silverware. So that I landed on stainless steel as this primary material doesn't seem like a mistake or a surprise at all. And this was a creatively kind of dynamic time. It was fertile. Again, kind of like living in the work. My studio was connected to the teaching studio. I was there all the time. So in the first weeks there, sequins became really important to how I add color and how I build structure. Figured out that you can weld directly through that middle hole to hold the sequin in place. And it came up earlier. People are asking if it's enamel, and it's plastic. But there's these array of colors and they have different textures, and I went down a sequin rabbit hole that I never expected would ever happen. So pushing scale, these are all large rings with vertically and across multiple fingers. We're talking like 3-inch rings, and then that one in the middle, that's probably like 2 inches off the finger. It's big, it's heavy. I'm worried less at this point about wearability and more about exploring these forms and seeing what I can do. And for all this work, there's no solid blueprint. So I start with bare fabricated stainless surfaces, and then I just kind of go. There's a kind of a finite amount of patterns and structures that you can build, because like as you stray out of that, it becomes chaotic, and our eyes like lose any sense of repeatability. Even in the middle here, above those cabochons, like that's getting a little busy. So part of the challenge in all this is to kind of like strike a balance between kind of like an ornate, like over the topness, and then a readability. Pushing scale further, these are large pendants, very big. So that one on the top, the front and back is the same one. It's 4.5 inches tall, 3 inches wide, and 2 deep. And object-wise, it's not enormous, but remember that the smallest kind of building material I have is 1 millimeter. I'm just like slowly coating this surface. The pin in the middle is about 4 inches tall and 1.25 inches wide. And this is before I found like the sequins I really love. So playing with metallic ones, translucent ones, how do they stack and how do they work together? So it's at this point that it sinks in that I really need to slow down on the scale. It's taking an incredible amount of time to finish and move over these surfaces. And importantly, it's more likely that small inconsistencies on one side are going to not be reflected on the other side. And this is kind of a ridiculous piece, just playing around. So this fuzzy bolo. And I'm just trying to play with materials and find new ways of capturing or setting things that wouldn't be normally seen in this context. It's large-ish, it's 2.5 inches cubed going all around. But with the complexity of the patterns in mind, this one really like simplified into that kind of like upward curve going towards the faux hair. Like I could easily add smaller details in between all of those granules, but trying to kind of let go and let something else be the kind of like center of the show. And then kind of transitioning to this. Yes, I'm making work, and yes, I'm teaching and all this, but I have multiple avenues of research at the same time. And I always think that like, part of academia, one of the biggest benefits is access to like EBSCO and library databases and all of these articles that are off limits. They're behind paywalls, and it's really unfortunate, really. But I had these kind of like at my fingertips at the time. So I'm researching and practicing traditional granulation. I had a strong feeling that if I'm going to be referencing this classic ancient technique, it'd be best that I knew how to do it and do it well. So I find traditional granulation to be like so tedious. It's like the worst to me. I don't know, I kind of like put up with it, but like all the steps, like I really like to be flexible in the studio and setting up the granules and getting like everything just right before you fuse everything is just not my cup of tea. But in the end, I became confident and capable with this. Silver granulation is what I taught primarily, but then the same things apply to gold. I made my own flux, like I found some like ancient Egyptian texts that mentioned like something else in addition to maybe something that we would use in a modern context. And going down some rabbit holes, I started using zinc oxide in that mixture, and that gave me a window of an extra like 40 degrees, which is enormous in this kind of in granulation in general. So I could really see what I was doing and go slowly, and I was using a hotter torch than you normally would, an oxyacetylene torch. So this all kind of came together in my own way. So the culmination of this research was this piece. It's inspired by John Paul Miller, late, great, he's my like superhero of metalsmithing. And this was like very specific for a show that snagged it, I think, in DC. It's about 5 inches tall and 3 wide, and then that middle strip is 22 karat gold and fine silver on a fine silver strip. So a detail of that section on the left. So the silver is granulated flat, and you can see us here, there's these kind of like arcs that are going in a pattern. I milled those out previously because granulating on a curve is tedious, to say the least. So these gave me kind of like a guideline, and it also gave me, instead of one point of contact for the fusion point, on either side of that milled trough, you had 2 points that were going to connect the granule there. So it gave it a little more structure. I do all this flat, and then you can bend it in like a hydraulic press or just by hand in this situation. So stainless granules are holding that in place on the top and bottom, and then those are forged Monel tapers coming out the very bottom there. And then just in context of wearing it. So it was a fun piece. I was really proud of this one, and like, you know, when you finish something and you just kind of like look at it, like you really, like being happy that like it came out like you expected is kind of understatement. All right, so we have a transition here. So that picture that I took in the last slide, those were all recorded the first week of the pandemic. So suddenly, like, school's asking for a new curriculum in a week, and suddenly, like, the studio program is not a studio program. So how do you pivot? And I turned to just more computer work. It was already there waiting, and I kind of transitioned seamlessly into doing more things like this. So I began thinking about scenarios where iteration and variability are built into the very design. So simulation as a design tool. How do you create like a circumstance for a design to happen instead of doing one-offs? So the idea is that the rendering is like more than enough, but in the back end of the computer software, as the simulation is running, I can stop it at any frame as it's moving, and you can extract a 3D file from that. And you can 3D print that, you can mill it, you can do all sorts of things. And this is the general setup for the whole thing. So if some of you use Rhino and Grasshopper, this might be kind of like this logic might be familiar. So I use Side Effects Houdini, and this is primarily used for special effects in movies and games. It's an incredible modeling tool. It can do like anything, really, which is pretty wild. It uses a procedural system where you have a connected tree of functions that affect the... What's this one? Okay. Thank you. In the middle here is that logic tree. So you can change something at the very top, like your very first shapes or meshes, and then if you adjust that by a millimeter, or like push something in, pull, whatever it is, after every step in that whole logic system, it's going to update that design at the very end. So it's about building systems and designing systems, and less about making like this one piece. It makes it easy to like change that kind of like circular shape into an oval, things like that as well. So when it functions properly, it's really elegant. Might be the best way to describe it. Because there's a million ways to get to this last scenario. You can like code it by hand, you can use different systems within the software to like make a shape in general, or make it move, any of those. And then in process, this is the same piece. So we're starting out with a piece that's ready to be 3D printed. So moving up in the tree here. So we're adding our first textures to it. This right side adds a sine wave animation across. And then we're merging those two together. And then making a loop will make it just repeat on end. And there's more information there, so it's slowing down. So remeshing it will make it a cohesive thing to print. And then in the file cache, all that grid on top of there lets me render it appropriately later. It kind of pretty much unfolds the thing to a flat sheet so you can add textures and color to it. And then going back to the other part of the tree, since we moved the animation to frame 13, we're starting out with something different than what we started with. And you can make that timeline at the bottom as long as you want. You can make it years long, per second. You can use any unit that you can think of. Let's see if this one starts. All right. So you can also do things like randomizing the placement of stone settings. And then I have this piece out, or like one version of this piece out there. So we have a finished piece, but going up, the global seed, you see out here on the right, so that's randomizing the numbers that drive the random placement. But what it's really doing is taking these setting tools and just moving those around on the surface. So again, that logic tree had the tools before they actually like cut into the surface. As you move those, it's going to change everything after that. And pieces like this came out pretty soon after. So again, moving the stones around on the top, and on the right, randomized sizes of stones as well. So these chromatic 3D printed pieces started to kind of emerge. And this is a 3D printed resin, so it's not a filament printer, but it's kind of like a vat of goo that hardens with UV light. And importantly, this is a UV-like resin where it has some elasticity. So instead of setting a stone, like where you're rolling something over the top or like adding to it, the material will expand and come back just enough that you can pop stones in. And you can pop granules into it, like whatever shape it is. It just leaves room, but holds it securely enough. So like the mokume piece and pearls before, these central components can be set with the granules. Like that heat is not damaging the surface in any way. And then with these, I'm working on finding like cohesion behind like all the design elements. I keep on adding more and more, and they're getting bigger. So this kind of like braided or twisted stainless kind of like industrial rope around the edge of this one, Tahitian pearl in the back. And then like on all of this work, the back is always going to be, you know, just as much as the front. It's just thinking about what I want the focus to be on. But I think it's like very important that like whoever has this, like when they take it off, they get a similar experience to wearing it and kind of showing it to the world. Below here is an evolved version of that first pink dome, and still with granules, but different arrays, and all these are different, you know, frames from the same simulation. All this color here is acrylic spray paint, and I would just spray it on, wait for a little while, and then wash it off. I'm just building like small layers of color and texture until I'm happy with the results. So playing with materials, this is milled corian. Like I'm always trying to think of something new. Corian's like interesting to mill because it has one of those like chemical smells that is like so good, but you know it's like just like destroying your lungs, kind of like xylene or something like that. But these are like a really cool simulation. So I did have a moving surface, and then I had something like a storm cloud almost coming across it, and as it interacted with the piece, it would make like certain points like pop up and peak. So like on the back there. Again, the back, considering this. And then if you're ever looking at like kind of like a range of my work, if there's a flat hallmark on it, on the bottom there, that's probably from, I don't know, like 3 or 4 years ago, and then these days they're domed. So just like little signifiers to me and an audience to know that things are progressing. So milling or any CAM work here, so computer-aided manufacturing. So you model it and then you gotta like set it up in CAM. It requires further computer work to tell the machines what to do. So this is just another avenue for me to learn more software and continue to combine all these elements. So in Little Rock, I was fortunate enough to have access to a whole bunch of 3D printers. And then through grants and whatnot, I was able to buy a mill, and that gave me a lot of freedom to in the moment experiment. Although you do have to set up the files, it's easier than like shipping it out and then you get a piece back in the mail like a week or 2 later, and to be surprised that you may not like it or you need to tweak something, etc. This came later on, so the dome trademark here, so I'm jumping ahead in time. So this is laminated corian this time, and this was a special brooch for the Penland auction. So taking geographical data and converting it into elevation maps. This recreates the Tow River Valley where Penland is. So kind of like just a little bit down. Oh, let me decline this phone call, sorry. So Penland from that red peak right there is just like down and right, maybe like a centimeter. And then playing with the machines and like setting it up in Houdini. That path right there is the Tow River. And then I gave it structure so I could set stones in there using granules as like little prongs going across. And this is big. This is maybe too big for wearability, but I hate saying that, but it's maybe like 4 inches across. So after 3 years, my tenure in Little Rock ended, and moving back to Savannah, I pursued a full-time kind of like career in the studio. This went more of a focus on production work, although I was already doing that, but really scaling up, still continuing to chase like one-off large unique pieces, and then this in-between zone of limited production came about. So all of these on the right, they have kind of like Monel settings, and then I'm using a bezel block to press out the shape for those. And the stones are generally like 14 millimeters across, 18 millimeters across. So I'm kind of like making 30 stone settings in a day, and then I start building them up into different formations on the rings. And then also playing with sequins. They kind of took a backstage for a little while, and I began thinking about these as color fields and blocking out large areas. And I wanted them to be more of the central focus than the granules themselves. These are about 3 to 5 inches across, and they're really wonderful to hold. So going back to that idea where maybe like simpler is better, just this array holding in the color is doing a lot of like the design and visual work that I'm looking for. So there's something about, whether right here, like simple solutions are the best solutions. Like I ignore that all the time, but I'm like proved wrong. So I really love this series, like just the tactility of them, they're fun to wear. And I like the color, and that issue with like scale and space, the sequins are usually 4 or 5 millimeters across, like those are filling up more surface area than stacking the granules themselves. Returning to settings, and this time more only in stainless steel. So the order of operations here and logic of it, like it makes sense. Like if someone gives you a custom order, you're like, I got it, and you kind of like go in the back and make it. And this is like absolutely a good thing. But that notion of like research and discovery that keeps on coming up, like boredom isn't the right thing, just I want to be kind of challenged with new things all the time. So it was like incredibly satisfying to like sit down and figure out the tension in stainless to, to not like crack these stones, but I'm still looking for something else. So I kind of strayed from jewelry a little bit. This goes into talking about color fields and really making that color the central focus of the whole thing. But it also goes back further. Before I ever made jewelry, I was making sculpture. I was enamored with silversmithing. I made books for a few years, like big sculptural books. So jewelry is like a newer part rather than things like this. So there's 2 small wall pieces. And these designs are mapped out in pixel software called Pixel. So it's like a free thing. But I essentially like took a picture of all the sequins that I have and digitize the color so I can build up these patterns on the computer and just like play around. And also in that digital space, like that is rather like risk-free except for time. Instead of like building this up and being unhappy with it. They give me a map to go by, and it's almost like paint by number. But then as you start to layer, like here on the bottom right of this pink piece, like layering the second level of those pink ones, like you start to get these really cool designs, and then how you fill in the space in between the color really can change the whole thing. So I could use the same color map with the sequins, but then change it dramatically just with how the granules are set up. And giant rings haven't gone away. So I have this with me. There's a case of work, and like feel free to like pick it all up. And as scale increases, like error will too. So when you're looking at it, it's really not that symmetrical. Like we have these matching elements, but like one side will have like 84 granules and the other will have 83. And that's like a gap of like 2 millimeters or something, which is like, I don't know, not great to me, So if you're bothered by your own kind of like, it's not an error really, and you learn to live with it. That the sequins and granules are all calibrated, so that precision really comes down to how am I doing the initial welding and how precise am I in that fabrication to get that bare stainless form. So a 0.5 millimeter on one side is really kind of, it can throw off the pattern in the end. So I'm always making these compromises, and there's this in-the-moment problem solving to keep the whole thing cohesive, but then really make do. So please take a look at it. Like you'll see these like little spots. And computer work is still very central to my whole process. And here I'm trying to marry kind of like bench fabrication and figuring that out with these processes developed in Houdini. So this is for a stainless steel printing setup. So the size and location of these stones will move and change within these set boundaries. So use my seats, my cutting tools, and then this whole part in pink right there, that's only to create 5 to 6 little spots for granules to go to set the stones. And then as you're playing through it, I'm getting all those iterations. So usually only the first 10 frames, each is printed and numbered as they're made and not to be repeated. So kind of like a giclée, like series of prints, something like that. But everyone gets their own version. But since there's this kind of like systematic setup in the beginning and I can get these stainless prints, I can start changing things like stone color, or do I use cabochons, or do I use any number of things that will like fit in that setting. So this helps satisfy my curiosity, and then from a client perspective, this gives them a unique piece to like take home and really live with. And this is the very first one. This is kind of the proof of concept. I call it frame 0. CZ's on the dome. We have that 3D printed piece on top. So there's kind of, I call it pen setting. I just made that up, but there's kind of like inverted prongs, but where the granules are holding the stones in. And then through this perimeter, this circular array of larger granules on the back, like that laser cut piece is plug welded to the front and then decorated afterwards. But I want it to appear as this kind of like seamless whole. So there's lots of hidden connections in all this work. So frame 3 and a ring and brooch variation. So the stones are 4, 6, and 8 millimeters. And for the brooch, like the proportions are normal. It hangs just fine, like in the upper third there. But then the ring shank on the bottom one, it's large enough where this would sit over your knuckles and your finger joint. And it's like not fun to wear in that context. So in this, if you're wearing it backwards, you end up with this large kind of dome over the flat of your hand, and your knuckles just kind of fit into that negative space. And in a similar work mode, but simpler, this is 3D, the straight up 3D modeling being printed, and bringing sequence back into the equation. So this has a V-shaped channel going all the way around, and the chain is held in with granules again. I'm going to create bright work, and then these are relatively quicker to make. And it's also the introduction of ball chain as a material. So for a long time, I'm struggling with like, how do I scale up? It always seems to be a thing, and ball chain kind of came about as, after the moment, an obvious answer. So they're hollow, they're thin, they're structural, so I can start, including these in the larger design. And then we have these, and I particularly like these because that kind of like chasing simplicity idea and playing with color comes into more of a cohesion. So the nylon neck piece, like I hadn't used these since that large pink dome you saw kind of around the middle of this. And it's almost as if I'm beginning to be able to collage past styles and experiments into new work. So maybe that's like the nature of studio practice, but that's new to me, and I'm just beginning to realize that. For a long time, I haven't had like a long-term consistent place to work in a style to work in until relatively recently. So everything building up to this moment, I'm very grateful for. And then changing gears a little bit. And this is where my current headspace is. So you're looking at a workflow for modeling intestinal villi. So these move and help sweep ingredients through and absorb nutrition. So the idea here is to recreate a scene similar to something you would see in biomedical imagery. And I love this stuff so much. Like electron microscopes, like images from that. It's just a fascinating, invisible world that's around us all the time. And I think about like how you have wild ideas and you're like, oh, this shape is original and this combination of things is so cool. And then you find out that it's like lives in the ocean or space or wherever, but it's there and it has been there. You just haven't been looking in the right place or asking the right questions. So on the left, you see the Houdini workflow again, and then we have this long kind of logic tree to arrive at the point. So these forms are animated, and there's this added twist that each shape has a fine cage around it that moves with the whole scene. And then on the right is the rendered setup in Marmoset Toolbag, and this is dedicated to rendering and adding textures and colors to the 3D models later. And I really love this because once you pull the file from the modeling software and put it here, everything speeds up. Everything's loaded, so you can really explore like the nooks and crannies of this kind of scenario that you've built. You can zoom in, so it's suddenly like you're like amongst buildings, like in an architectural setting. We can zoom out here and think about jewelry or wall pieces. And this is my favorite rendering from that whole setup. So it's like it's from an actual picture, but it's like a fluorescent environment to help highlight this like cage around each of the villi. So the big question is like, why put so much effort into doing this? And it's not a short process, and it's like something that I'm really struggling with. It's like, how do I reconcile this like atmosphere and mood and detail that's created in this environment that you can do on the computer and be so flexible with? And then how does that interact with my limitations in the studio, which is time, money, and experience and skill? So how does this tie in with stainless granulation? And then the idea of my identity is kind of like tied to that and jewelry in many ways. Like, how do I marry these two worlds? Does it connect to jewelry at all, or metalsmithing? You know, like big kind of esoteric questions. And it's like obvious that I love working in this hybrid computer bench environment, but I don't know how to answer those questions. And that's kind of what I'm kind of working with right now, and why it's been like wonderful to be able to talk to you about it, because it's allowed me to like think through all of this. So I'm really looking forward to figuring all that out. Thanks.
Well, that was fabulous. And part of the fabulous part of it is that somehow we're ahead of schedule. And I'm not really sure how we got there. Oh, do you have questions? Yeah, please, come on up here. Forget what everything I just said, just forget about all of this. I have a question.